Welcome to today's webinar on exploring the C-suite of options for resolving conflict, co-locating, communicating, cooperating, collating, and I'm sure you all must have a C as well to add. The discussion will focus very much today on conflict between humans or between humans and human organizations or institutions. But there are other forms of conflict. I mean, I've had conflict from time to time with my automobile when it doesn't do what it was supposed to do, or the drain pipe on my roof that continues to leak. In those cases, I usually turn to my own need to learn. I'll even turn to ChatGPT when marbles fell into the dishwasher, and I need to figure out how to get them anyway. The discussion today will be about resolving human conflict. I can recall when in government, Bruce Rawson trying to address the conflict between a number of agencies by setting up a co-location to bring them all into the same space, something that we as parents might sometimes do with our siblings when they just can't stop arguing, is either separate them or put them in a room together and let power resolve it, or a rationale, or they just ultimately wear out. But we brought Greg MacGillivray, who many of you know of Greg with his work with scenarios to strategy. He, from time to time, will introduce into our webinars the relevance of collaboration. And so I'm going to, without any further ado, introduce Greg and his colleague, Julie, and let him do the introductions, and we'll get started. So over to you, Greg.
Thanks, Perry, and good afternoon, everyone. Lots we can talk about today. I think we'll spend about 15 or 20 minutes just providing some overviews of maybe a little bit of where we've come from. And I just have a short presentation on something we call creating collaboratives. And, you know, we've seen, and really what's happened over the last 200 years since we industrialized, we dusted off an old 200-year-old idea at that time of something called a corporation, which was set up historically to allow the transfer of assets across generations and creating individuals at law to hold assets so they could be passed on. When we industrialized, the sole proprietor, the small artisans and others that had the opportunity to industrialize needed a way to not only get the capital to industrialize, the many thousands of pounds required to build a shoe plant, for example, and the people, the hundreds of people to build, design, operate, say, a shoe factory, for example. And it's that form of organization that was embraced to accelerate industrialization. And that same form of organization, comprised of departments and teams, was adopted by government as a way to deliver government services, and the not-for-profit sector, albeit different shareholders. You know, governments generate tax revenue and spend it on programs, advancing legislation, regulations, programs. And the not-for-profit sector meets their mission, often reporting to the community that they serve. What's happened is those organizations have all grown up with purpose. About 50 years ago, we came up with something called strategic planning, and organizations started having mission statements, purpose statements, visions, values, focus areas, goals, strategies to move ideas forward and get better. And what we've grown up over the last couple hundred years is a whole bunch of complexity. What we created through individual actions are very complex systems, public, private, not-for-profit sectors working together to meet needs in society. And that the existence of those systems, many of us believe we've actually outstripped our capacity. If I think about how I get my cup of coffee here this afternoon, that's a 3-hour conversation on where those beans were grown, how they were roasted, shipped, produced, the water systems, the systems to create the mugs. So that's just a simple example of the kind of complexity that we're facing. Again, we're also facing unprecedented change. Think of all the economic, social, technological, environmental, political, and other changes that continually reshape our world. The collision of these systems that have served us well over the last 200 years, and rapid change has created unprecedented complexity. And that complexity, along with the reality of many players, differing interests participating in these systems, make it tough to improve them, solve a problem, or pursue an opportunity. In Tough Problems, author Adam Kahane, an Order of Canada member that was involved in scenario planning on the future of South Africa, concluded that today's reality requires systems thinking, something we've done at S2S for over 20 years, engagement processes that promote dialogue and collaboration. And I would argue that while most agree this is what we need to do, I'd like to share a new approach on how we can do it. The solution, we call it creating collaboratives. Of the many collaborative endeavors we've undertaken to date, none are 100% inclusive, and that's a problem when you don't have full representation of the stakeholders. None are organic. Many of them run on command and control strategic planning processes. And so what I'd like to propose is a new form of organization that can bust silos. A collaborative is a new form of organization, 100% inclusive body of stakeholders that are welcome to join, all who share a common purpose. They grow organically across geography to where they're needed. So how do we build them? We have a simple way of building a collaborative. On the left-hand side, we have some ideas around what is organic collaboration, the attributes of collaborative leaders, talking about diversity and dialogue practices, which I'll touch on a little later when we connect with Julie. A single session where a cohort of individuals, organizations, groups focus on a common purpose, talk about their values, and decide what they need to meet their needs to address that shared purpose. And then there's things that they can do around different types of collaborative leadership infrastructure, technology choices, and something many of us know about theory of change as a way to keep that shared improvement story on track in the absence of a strategic plan. This is what a collaborative looks like. We talk about shared DNA. Why are we here? We share a purpose. Maybe it's to build a community garden, a stronger family, advancing mental wellness across Alberta, decarbonizing Canada. Who is at the table? Well, that's the folks that get started. And then who else could be interested in this? We focus on something called the how, which are looking at shared values as standards of behavior, and ground rules that we make choices on to say how we're going to work together before we get to the what. And the what, when we get to the what, we talk about shared interests, shared solutions, and that becomes the DNA, which allows individuals, groups, and organizations to show up 100% as they are. There's no strategic plan to buy into. The only cost of admission is living the few shared values, for example, being inclusive, respectful, and lawful, and believing that they can contribute to the collaborative shared purpose. Sounds like a neat idea? The benefits of a collaborative is unprecedented awareness. You can have members, and not only do people become aware that the collaborative exists, but there are others that share the purpose that you have. For example, decarbonizing Canada, there's probably 150 organizations committed to that purpose, and they can join up as they are and become aware of each other. With awareness, they can communicate with each other through forums and other vehicles that the collaborative members decide they want to employ. And after becoming aware of others, communicating, that opens the door for collaboration, projects, forums, and more. A little bit of coordination, a few coordinators, a very light on the resource intensiveness, and things like backbone organizations can be used. A collective impact principle, having backbone organizations just makes collaboration happen a whole lot better. So a good idea, obviously, more must be better. Even more, even more. Get to the point that perhaps this solution can create more complexity than it tries to solve. So how do we make sense of this? How can we build awareness across our complex systems without creating more complexity? How do we make sense of all of these collaboratives? Again, each collaborative organizes itself organically based on the choice of its members. Like nature, we can organize by purpose and by geography, family, community, a municipality, a province, a region, a nation, multinational, and even international. My hope is one day that this infrastructure can be applied to move the United Nations sustainability goals forward. And much like nature, nature does nothing without purpose, and humanity can learn much from nature. Again, we've created systems, we've certainly thrived. We've also faced some very tough problems in front of us today, and we've got some remarkable opportunities. Just as a single collaborative grows organically, many collaboratives will grow and thrive organically. Where a collaborative thrives is based on the choice of its members, the choices of shared purpose across a defined geography. This clarity builds greatest awareness among those in our active in our complex systems, opening again the door to communication and collaboration. It helps us improve our systems, tackle problems, and pursue opportunities. So that's all I have to say about that right now. I'd like to introduce Julie, who has some ideas on conflict resolution and ways of being. So much conflict resolution is a process geared so much to solve a problem. And perhaps there's a different way of just recognizing our humanity and get started by just talking to one another. So if Julie's available, she can take over.
That's great, Greg. Thank you so much. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julie Hrdlicka, and I'm a mediator and facilitator with transformative practice here in Calgary. And I'm really grateful to be able to share some ideas around the work that I do in mediation and facilitation using transformative practice. Last week, it was really great. The discussion about anger was really interesting. And Mel, you did a really good job at really highlighting the many things that are impacting people and making them frustrated and angry, and the impacts of that too. So we know when people are angry, they're reactive, they isolate, they disconnect. They might connect too, but it's often not very healthy connections. And we're really seeing, and that's turning into conflict, right? We're seeing that in our families. It's hard to even talk about some things that we think are important in the world with people around us, whether it's family or friends, work colleagues, neighbors. It's really difficult to have those conversations these days. And so I think when we talk about that idea of anger, and then how do we get to collaboration? Well, we're seeing there's a lot of conflict. So we have to find ways in order to address, move through, look at that conflict. And so the idea is I've been practiced as a transformative practitioner for mediation. And there's different ways to look at conflict, to approach conflict. One is around power, right? Power theory. And power theory basically tells us that it's the idea of power over, dominance. And we see that in politics and war. And then we have other theories that are around conflict that are, for instance, rights theory. And this happens in our courts. You know, two people are contested, they're contesting competing rights, like in a divorce. I have the right to this, you have the right to that. And then you have a judge, adjudicator making a decision. And then you've got, needs and interest theory, which is basically win-win solution, the idea of compromise. And so I went through my own rather large conflict in my life when I was a Calgary Board of Education trustee back in 2015 to 2021. And I dealt with a really big conflict that really impacted my life, not only at work, but also my home life, and really turned my life upside down. And so I do speak to you here from lots of learning that I've done over the last number of years around conflict. And but it led me to the idea of transformative theory, which is this crisis in the human interaction. It's a crisis in human interaction. And that really spoke to me. And it spoke to me because I look at the world today, and like I talked about earlier, is we're having a really difficult time talking to our neighbors and our friends and our family. We're having a difficult time getting to the table and having those interactions because we have different views, and many of us are emotional about it. We're reactive. So for me, it made sense that conflict is about this crisis in our interaction. And if that's what we're talking about here, then this was a really interesting theory to me. Often when we talk about transformative theory also, the idea is it's not about a resolution. That's not the goal. The goal is to change the interaction from a negative one, when you're really angry and you're unsettled and you feel confused, to a place of being stronger, calmer, and clearer. And also when you're in that negative or destructive state, you're self-absorbed, you can't see anybody else, you're suspicious and defensive. And how can you move to a place of being more trusting and more opening and understanding? And we all know we can do this because we're humans and we get through conflict. Like, if you have kids 100 times a day, you're getting through conflict, right? So we do this. We know how to do this. And what I'm seeing happening in the world today is because of our fear, the fact that we're reacting so much to things that we're getting stuck. And so I'll just share a scenario. Like, you think of moving through conflict and your kid comes home late from, and they broke curfew again. Your emotions are really, really high. You're yelling and you're angry at them. You may feel really unsettled and confused, and you feel hostile and really suspicious of them because here we go again. And then they tell you that the car broke down and that their cell was dead and that they had to walk 5 kilometers home. Once you have some more information, you become calmer and your tone shifts and things become more clear. You're able to hear them, and you move to a more welcoming and trusting and engaging discussion with your kids. And so this is how we see this all the time. We go through conflict and do this. But right now we're seeing a lot of us are really stuck in this, that we can't get through it. So some of the work that I'm doing with people is we need to kind of go back to the basics. And I only have a couple minutes, so I can't go into tons of detail, but it really is the basics. It's around active listening, and it's creating intentional spaces that we are actually using our muscles and building the muscles around active listening, around validating people's feelings, reflecting what you're hearing from people, and empathy. So these pieces that we really have to dive in on, because they're strong forces that are pulling us apart. And someone who believes in a world that, my kids and my grandkids are going to have a place to live, and that they're going to have fresh water, and they're going to have an environment that they can be outside and enjoy, that there's no more of these vile wars that are destroying us. When I look at where I want to go, we have to find a way to communicate to each other in order to get there, right? And so I think we've lost through so many things, through COVID, through all of the violence in the world, issues around separation, identity is really dividing us. So how do we do the opposite? How do we come back to the table? How do we come together? And so I'll kind of leave it at that, because I do want to engage in dialogue with everybody else. And thanks so much.
Promised you a few simple tools. I think that was part of Perry's original billing for today. There's some very simple ones. If we go back to Adam Kahane, Adam talks about 3 forces that guide a lot of our interactions. All of us, it's power, love, and justice. So power is to achieve purpose, our desire to achieve whatever purposes we have in front of us, whatever we want to do. That's a key drive in human beings. Love is our desire to connect with others. And justice is just keeping an eye to greater fairness. So when you think about your interactions with other people, if you think about those three things and trying to understand what someone's trying to achieve in their purpose in an interaction vis-a-vis your own purpose, we all have a desire to be connected. We have 2 million years before Homo sapiens showed up as emotionally connected species working together, and 200,000 years as Homo sapiens in tribes. We are naturally collaborative, and we have this desire to connect. No man or woman can do it on his or her own. And this idea of justice, what is really fair around us? As I achieve my purpose and look to achieve my purpose, I should keep an eye to fairness and justice around me. And Adam would say those three things are kind of a tri-yang, if you will, instead of a yin-yang, but three things. Another thing I'd like to share that's very simple, and you can just make a note of this. The Arbinger Institute has been trying to bring people together around the world, and they have a book out called The Anatomy of Peace. And they say in any interaction, as you connect with another person, and rather than just reacting to whatever they pitch at you, ask yourself the question, what would love do? In response to that comment Julie made to me, what would love do? Would love flash back at Julie? Or would love seek to better understand Julie and ask her a question more? Tell me more. Why do you feel that way? Maybe show some empathy. So that's a very simple thing. And the Institute coaches to say, either do what love would do or honor the fact that you have thought about it. And maybe you're too busy to help that homeless person on the street. You're late for a meeting, but honor the fact that you actually thought about it and had considered it. And they make the argument, if you do anything but those two things, you become crooked. Just like a wall, you become tilted. And then you have to justify all the reasons why you're too good or they're not too good enough, but they did. And if you can just try and do those things as you interact with people, you start to build the habit of just not reacting and just saying, giving yourself some pause and avoid becoming crooked and having to justify your reaction. So if we all just acted a little bit more with love in the world, things would be a lot better. In terms,
I'm going to jump in here for a moment, and I appreciate the relevance of love, mediation, attempting to resolve the acceptance or the lack of acceptance between two people. But when they can't even agree on the problem, let's forget for a moment the interpersonal conflict, and that is the personalities clash, and address the fact that they're clashing over something, not necessarily rejecting one another, but rejecting one another because of a problem. To focus on that problem, you go to the court, and a judge will make a decision between two angry lawyers. You go to a mediator, and the mediator will help you agree that you two are going to accept the fact that someone will help you through your personal conflict, that is, you don't like one another, that's the grounds for divorce, or help you resolve a problem. Often today, people can't agree on the problem. Take environment, for example. The conflict of a social nature here between groups is that one agrees there's a problem, and the other one doesn't agree that there is even a problem, much less we can't even get to the solution yet. Because the solution, you can't get the solution because you can't even agree on there being a problem. Therein lies one of the biggest issues we got on why people are today so argumentative, angry, and quick to criticize. They can't even agree that there's a problem. Go ahead, Julie. You're muted.
Thanks, Perry. That's a great question. And I think that's one of the things that really brought me towards transformative mediation is this idea that we have to come together and find a solution, right? That's transformative mediation is not about that. You have different opinions and we recognize that individuals are different. And it's actually, the goal should not be to make you come together and find a solution. The goal is to look at the interaction that's happening and it's destructive, right? It's not working. So how do we move it to an interaction? We can still disagree. We can still end the mediation and we never want to talk to each other again. But during the mediation, we felt strength, that we got clarity on where that person stood. There's all this stuff that was in the way, the rumors, the rhetoric, that we cleared through that. And in the end, I've got clarity. I know I actually, by what I've heard today, where this person stands, I actually don't want to be friends with them anymore. And I'm really clear on that. And to have that strength of making your own choice rather than feeling like you have to compromise or fit into a box of a solution, and that you're in that place of strength, you're also able to hear the other person. And so get the clarity from them of where they stand. Okay, you stand there, Bill. That's really clear for me. I'm good to break off this relationship. Or actually, that wasn't that big of a deal. There was all this other stuff that got mixed up in all this. And now today, through our conversation, I'm able to get clarity that, yeah, we can move on. We're going to be good. Let's work on this next project together. So it is about self-determination and being able through the process of transformative theory and reflecting people. So often we paraphrase, or this is what I heard you saying. Well, you're interpreting what that person is saying. This guy is being a real jerk, right? And so to actually say, yeah, you know what, Bob? This guy's being a real jerk, right?
Okay,
to actually hear your words through a process.
So what we've done is we've introduced the process. So we've now established interpersonal respect. But the problem goes on. I respect you, you respect me. We're going to have a civil dialogue, but to resolve this conflict at some point in time, we're gonna stay together, continuing to negotiate until someone says, you two can either compromise, you two can battle it out and power will ultimately resolve, or, and I'm looking for this or, does collaboration help take you closer? I mean, having achieved respect doesn't mean I've solved that problem. We can't talk to one another. But sooner or later, these two parties need to get together to address a problem. Let's say it's a real problem. Go ahead, Greg.
Do you have an example? Would you like to?
Oh, sure. I mean, you can take the capital gains tax. You can take climate change. You can take the death of George Floyd. I mean, the interpretations and the action that's called for differs dramatically between two ideologies, often between two religions, often between two groups that have aligned with in taking different perspectives. So we can agree that they'll be respectful in the parliament or in the legislature or in the courts, but respect isn't enough.
So the next step is to shift the conversation from one of positions to one of interests. Okay. Interests are hopes, fears, needs, desires, concerns. Perry, you have an interest in building a better family. What are you looking for? What are your hopes, needs, desires, concerns? Julie, Norm, Jeff, if we were all one family, we could list a bunch of broad interests. And if we understood your interests, Perry and Norm and Jeff, those interests go up on a wall as interests that we share. And now we shift and collaborate on that roster of what are now shared interests. They're shared because we understand they're important to all of us. If they're important to one of us, they become important to all of us. And any solution we come up with must meet all of the interests expressed. By having those interests identified, a clearer example might be a First Nation being open to a conversation about having a pipeline built across their lands. Rather than negotiating land rates and term sheets, you could have broad interests. Like I'm the CEO of Enbridge and I require for my shareholders an economic project. I require a certain amount of right of way to build this infrastructure. I require sites to build compressor stations, broad interests. The First Nation may say, I would really like some power, some power off your system. I might like some employment. I might like some other opportunities. I might like my historical lands, my traditional lands to be respected, very important lands. So you put these interests up and we all understand one another's interests. And then we can collaborate in a very creative space. And actually 1 + 1 + 1 = 5 in terms of the ideas we can come up with. We've gone from adversarial, I need, to what do we want? And you can start to have win-win ideas come up with and come up with ideally a shared solution that everyone can support. That's at the tail end of our collaborative leadership process. We've already talked about how we're going to meet and make decisions and commitments, confidentiality, how we're going to conduct ourselves. So that's just a way of working together.
Okay, Dennis, you've got
Yeah, Craig, Greg, I'm sorry. Carrying on with that though, is that how do you get over the interests where an organization is so entrenched in those interests that they're not willing to, move off of them as such. And we see that in environment and in energy and so on and so forth. The interests are solid, and we're not seeing any way to get around that. So that's sort of the question.
Okay, let me walk you through to collaboration. The first thing a deputy is going to do, or a parent may well do, or a leader may well do, is say to the two parties, let's get together. That's co-locate. That's the first C in my C-suite. The second is, okay, now I've got you together. Let's communicate. Okay, let's talk to one another. Instead of talking past one another, let's have a dialogue so indeed you are respecting one another and you're not talking over or past or through, you're communicating. Third level is cooperation. Now, getting cooperation is often very difficult with parties that have never really worked together. So you give them a project. You give them something innocent to do together. I know I often do workshops or events, and I have them work toward some project whereby they have both achieved a goal where before they didn't even talk to one another. Now they've been given a task. It's a rather neutral, it's innocent. Then we go beyond cooperation into collaboration. We get into, Greg, we really are going to work on that problem. We've acknowledged that there is a problem. We will work on that one because we've now worked together, communicated, cooperated. Now we can move to the next level. And I mean, working some years ago with a minister in the Alberta government, he was adamant that you're not going to get to collaboration if you can't get through these first 3 steps first. Co-locate, communicate, cooperate, then he would get to collaborate. So Greg, do you want to comment on that? When you are introducing a collaborative solution or a collaborative process, do you take them through stages to get there, or do they jump right into collaboration right off the bat?
I think there's some education that goes up front in terms of our specific collaborative leadership approach. It talks about the value of collaboration, the need to have competence, working on ourselves as individuals, and then having a process to work forward. We do build on the collaborative why, who, how, what approach of moving forward. And we've had very good examples of success in bringing folks together. Say you have a company that's owner operated with a half a dozen employees, and the owner wants out, approaching retirement age. So we've had an exiting owner express his interests, the idea that he wants to see his legacy continue. He wants to be compensated at some point. And the employees actually want to see their employment continue, and they want to take over the business. They would like some support based on this person's 40 years in the business. And you can start to see how interests can come together, and you can actually come up with a solution that's a lot more than, here, Fred, here's a bunch of money, and the employees run out to the bank or go to friends and family to fund it. You have a much richer, maybe Fred has a transitioning out period. Maybe he's a lifetime coach and he always has a few fingers or a hand in the business that he's done for 40 years and he knows a lot about. So starting with interests, making sure you get the values right first, values and interest-based conversations. And you only come up with a solution. You only have to agree with what you agree to. Chief of the First Nation said, what am I signing up to here by embarking on this journey or this process or this way of working? And it was, Chief, it's nothing that you don't agree to at the end. And if it doesn't work for you, you walk away.
So a question, I think I know the answer, but I'll pose it anyway. So compromise is an acceptable solution.
Well, is it compromise when your interests are met and others are too?
I'm
I don't
saying,
know if that's compromising or just being open.
I'm saying going
possibilities.
50-50. My interests aren't met perfectly, yours aren't met perfectly, but I'll accept the fact that we're going to go halfway with one another. Go ahead, Julie.
I would say where we've run into trouble around this is around identity. So if you're asking someone who is Indigenous or LGBTQ, if you're asking them to compromise their identity, you're going to run into trouble, right? At the board, I was asked to compromise who I was, my ability to collaborate and my ability to be empathetic, and I was told I can't be that anymore. So that's where we run into trouble, is compromising on those things that are really important and priorities in how we identify as humans. And we all identify differently, but it's those key pieces that it could be your job, it could be your family, it could be your gender, whatever it is. When you're asked to compromise on those things, people are not going to do it. And that's what we're seeing happen in today's world. There's shifts and changes that are happening. People are being told to behave this way and act this way. And others are saying, we're not taking it anymore. We don't want a world like that anymore, that we're left out of it. And so that's where we're seeing a lot of the conflict that's happening. And so it is intense. And so we have to, from my perspective, we have to find another way. And when I talk about transformative theory and practice, look, it is about emotions. Conflict is about emotions. So get it on the table, right? Get it on the table. Don't be afraid, because we have the anger. We talked about it last week. It's there. So if we try to and the idea of having a respectful dialogue with such a diverse communities, right, that talk to each other in different ways. Right? Some get really heated and excited, and some people might think that that's too much. I can't handle that. You need to be more respectful. Well, what does that mean? So, what I'm talking about is really sitting at the table with people and them creating the dialogue. I only intervene when they're in maybe a state of, it's called self-absorption or weakness. So when they're, you notice their state that they're really unsettled or confused and they can't get anything out, or what they're saying isn't coming out as articulate as they'd like to, then I could reflect that. Or if they're really self-absorbed and they're saying, hey, like, I know what's right, you don't know what's right, and then I reflect that. And so I'm not doing anything other than jumping in the conversation to support them, but it's up to them to do it themselves.
We live in a world, and I can think of North America, where in the United States, they want to be a melting pot, that everyone will ultimately blend into this common ground. Whereas in Canada, we accept multiculturalism. You can each retain your own individual cultural perspective. So in Canada, we say we'll accept diversity, but we don't seem to be accepting diversity, because we've got people running around saying, but you've got to blend together. You got to say, I accept you as you are, and I have to feel that. I can't just say it. I've got to be respectful enough that I've got to agree with everything. It seems to me that in a world of rapid change such as we're in today, whether it be socio-demographic, economic, socio-demographic, and cultural, that asking people to get along is asking for an awful lot. we've got to, I think, accept differences. And that's the word respect, I guess, that you put forward, and stop arguing about we've got to have a melting pot where everybody's got to ultimately accept that what your gender is and your gender, I'm going to have to accept. I don't have to accept that. Why would I have to accept? Why can't I just live as separate but equal?
Just being respectful is the bottom line.
Yeah.
Having an open mind, the collaborative, the core values of a collaborative are being inclusive, being welcoming, being respectful. All who show up are respectful. You don't have to agree to be respectful. You can be in violent disagreement in principles and views, but you can express differences respectfully.
Now that perspective, I think, works quite well until you get such a thing as you get power, you get military intervention. And now it looks like we got to fight it out, because being passive aggressive in an environment where the other party is being aggressive and your survival is at risk is a whole nother situation. Kevin, I saw you nodding your head. Either you were falling asleep or you had something to offer there. You're muted. Kevin, you're muted. There you go.
Yeah. Few comments. First of all, to Julie's point, conflict is certainly about emotions. And so I wonder if we, as a species, lack emotional maturity. And I wonder if as a species, our emotional evolution has not kept up with our social and technological evolution. Another point, Perry, to that kind of difference between the Canadian and the American sort of process of melting pot versus mosaic, and I would suggest that it's again not a black and white issue. I think there's room for spectra in there.
Okay. I like most things. I mean, there's got to be gray there someplace.
Yeah, I guess I've been, and Julie probably has more expertise on this, but you know, and you and I have discussed, Perry, about the evolution of our species, and there was a comment that I had seen somewhere that as a species, our emotions are Paleolithic, our institutions are medieval, and our technology is godlike. So that's got to create some sort of conflict and exacerbate issues of conflict.
Well, I mean, I think as our institutions are wedded to something in the past and maybe haven't kept up, and that's the role. I mean, these institutions are typically established to help maintain the status quo. Mm-hmm. But with the degree of change that's underway right now, you're asking institutions to be somewhat mobile, which is counter to their actual existence. Now, whether they can be transformed or whether we can have evolution in their development, whether it be a university accepting changes to free expression, or whether or not we need a revolution, is almost up in the air right now and under discussion. Mm-hmm. Is how far do we have to go in order to accommodate the changes that are in front of us, socio-demographic for starters. Mm-hmm. I mean, the cultural clashes that's going on between different religions, which we thought was in the past, mm-hmm. because we were rather homogeneous in a Christian society, but we now have cultures clashing that haven't clashed since the Middle Ages all over Europe, and now being introduced into Canada and the US. We shouldn't be surprised. We are revisiting a clash that was not resolved 500 to 1,000 years ago. It's up in the air again, and the institutions that we have today don't seem to be a heck of a lot better. Mm-hmm. And we've now got the nuclear confrontation again, that a treaty may not be good enough in order to resolve conflict or prevent it. Maybe we haven't resolved it, but we've prevented it, which is a concept we haven't addressed at great length today, which is preventing conflict versus resolving it. Mm-hmm. Julie, I think you've touched on that in the prevention of conflict by achieving a level of respect that's acceptable. And we will live on with our differences, called diversity, which seems to be acceptable today, and inclusivity seems to be accepted today. We're not going to have equality, but we might have equity.
Let me test Kevin, thank you for mentioning the E word, emotion. I think we've become rational animals for the last 200,000 years, and particularly in the last 200 years. And we've really forgotten that deep down we are emotionally driven first. So we fall into conflict, whether that's a saber-toothed tiger in the jungle or a disagreement on climate change. Guess what happens? Conflict, fight or flight kicks in. Your limbic brain, not your rational brain, it elevates your emotions so you can fight or flight really fast. It shuts down your rational thinking because those humans that thought too long got weeded out of the gene pool by the saber-toothed tiger. And that's how we think and do, even though we can make entirely rational cases, put all the evidence forward to make decisions. We think we make decisions that way. We don't. It's still that limbic brain that's the decision-making part of us that doesn't do numbers or language. And we're in or we're out. And the hair goes up in the back of your neck. And as soon as you're in conflict, now we freeze, the third F, because we're not being devoured by a tiger, but we freeze because we're stuck, or we become stupid when we need to be the smartest. Our emotions go up. And, you know, if you've ever heard, when I used to coach hockey, we had the 24-hour rule on feedback after games and practices. And it would be amazing the number of parents that came back. I was ready to rip you a new one yesterday, but today I'm good. You know, so as soon as you get triggered, and that's not for snowflakes and woke people, we all get triggered. And as soon as we get triggered, that's when we have to really grab hold of ourselves and our emotions and say, let's calm down, let's breathe a little, and maybe even take a break in the conversation. Because that's, and if anyone would like to push back on that, we've got a smart cohort of people.
One of the things that we haven't really touched on is, over the last, I don't know, 1,000, maybe 2,000 years or so, a lot of thinkers and philosophers have developed the precepts of logic, and so we have a well-developed I guess, process around the principles of logic and the principles of critical thinking. And I would suggest that we probably don't do a very good job of teaching critical thinking in our academics. And I see that. I mean, I've worked with engineers and who should be particularly good at critical thinking, but who aren't. And so I think that's a really important thing, and understanding the ability to be mindful of our own biases, and we all have biases, and that mindfulness is something that could help mitigate some of the conflict around blaming the other guy. We see in politics, you ask a political leader, well, why are they in conflict? Well, it's the other guy's fault. It's like, but mommy, Johnny hit me first, and so if we don't have the maturity as a civilization to resolve conflicts on an interpersonal relationship, and we've got this oncoming pressure of technology and AI, how the hell are we going to survive as a species?
Now you brought AI into the story. I was just on the sidebar having a chat with Marie, who noted that most religious conflict is actually a power conflict, and I commented back that absolutely. I mean, the two religions are arguing over faith, and you're not going to resolve faith through reason. Faith is not based on logic, and so therein lies a fundamental, possibly irresolvable conflict when it's between two people of different faiths. And I think that's almost, climate change has become a religion. It doesn't, science says it has a position, but then scientists are lining up on and getting caught up in ideologies and politics as well. So, who can you trust in this environment where we now have ideological pit bulls going at it tooth and nail, and you sit as a third party witnessing this, waiting to see who's going to resolve, and full well that sooner or later power is going to come in, and the International Court of Criminality will make its statement, and somehow everybody and their brother is going to have to fall in the line, but they don't. Because they don't trust an intermediate force, which is why I really like what Julie brings forth, which is the concept of mediation. I'm not a real big fan of going to the courts. That is last resort. It's a crapshoot at that point. But if we can get parties to agree to mediate, go ahead, Julie.
I was going to add to that, Perry. I think, you know, I mean, it is choice that people go to the courts, but I really think there's lots of movements that are out there that say, you know, the system is not working and that people are ending up in prison. And when you're put into prison, it's definitely not going to be a restorative process for you, right? You're not going to learn from that. You're going to come back out, and many people are more wounded when they come back out. One of the things that I'll point out when we talk about conflict, and this is where I have wonderings and around compromise, when we talk about conflict, when I do my practice, we focus on the difference. So where's the conflict? Mm-hmm. Instead of where are commonalities? Where can we come together? Because if we don't address where the conflict is and get some clarity around the conflict, then it's going to keep popping up and keep popping up and keep popping up. But until we get clarity on really where we're missing the boat with each other, and then we can make our own decisions on whether we want to work together or not, or be together. And it's up to us, each person at the table, to make those decisions. And that's a really, I think for me, that is such an opportunity of strength, self-determination. And if people can start feeling empowered in their choices, man, that's where I think we can change the world. Because right now people feel hopeless and helpless, but making their own choices that they've thought through because they've had this conversation and they've got clarity on where this person stands, then I'm making my own choice and what I want to do and how I want to go forward.
Well, Julie, the discussion which you've just elevated, which is interpersonal conflict, emerged in the discussions we were having at what's going on in municipalities today. One of the fundamental issues among councils is the amount of public apathy, implying that the public faced with conflict has just given up. And that is very serious when a governing body in a democracy is dependent upon an informed citizenry to vote and make decisions. Yeah. If people have given up, then all sorts of special interests can take over. So public apathy is one of the most serious problems that a democracy can face. So Dennis, you might want to jump in on this, is how does one go about resolving public apathy when that public apathy is a byproduct of the way the councils have been behaving?
Yeah, certainly. Well, collaborative leadership is part of the answer, and I guess honest leadership is part of the answer. When we sit as a public and look at some of the decisions that are made, you basically shake your head. So that creates the apathy, and the apathy is created because you can't influence it. Nobody's listening to you, and there's no way to influence the decisions that have already been made, that have been basically forced upon you. So that makes it very, very difficult. Yeah, yes, more collaboration with the public, being more honest with them, engaging them in solutions, and trying to meet what the public sees as their needs. And of course, within all of that, you have all the various factions within the public that have their own special interests that are trying to promote that. So that just complicates the aspect about collaboration again. So
well, one of the observations that I personally made in looking at the issues at the municipal level, which is a public institution, it's corporate, was listening isn't enough. To listen and not act, to listen and show no intent or no evidence that you've heard me is pretty serious. And we do hear, well, listening is the answer. I don't think listening is the answer either. I think sometimes the answer is, this is not our problem. You're talking to the wrong person. And too often municipalities jump in and decide what color they're going to paint their highways, or what they're going to start doing things well beyond their terms of reference, which is really not within the terms of reference what government is all about. So one of the problems government has gotten itself into, and some of these organizations, Julie, get into, is that they listen and then they act when they shouldn't be acting at all. And I remember my MP, why don't you go to Ottawa and do nothing for a while?
You have it at all three levels. So you have at the federal level,
All
trying to do everything for everybody.
Well,
Then the
government has gotten into everything from who belongs in what bedroom to what's in your pants. I mean, this
And
is
that, and that ties to what Julie was saying as well. You try to resolve what you can do yourself.
Right.
But there's so much overriding how we handle ourselves on a daily basis, governed by government.
Yeah.
And you can only do so much without stepping beyond the law.
Sure.
And so that becomes a conflict. Now, your other point about listening is very true. We talk about having public forums and public hearings and those kinds of things. And however, a lot of that is just input. Maybe we're listened to, but the actions that come out of the listening do not follow what the input was. So that also furthers the aspect of apathy.
it's good cosmetics to imply you're listening. But if there isn't action,
Yes.
if there isn't action, in fact, you may have exacerbated the problem because you've conveyed an expectation that you will be listened to and there will be action. And when there isn't, you may find a more volatile reaction and response because you've mismatched my expectations. If you're going to listen, you better be prepared to act or show evidence of acting. And sometimes that means referring someone to someone else, just taking some action, having another forum, referring it to another party, I'll leave it at that.
Well, sometimes it means a delay. That is something that the group never thought of doing. And
Right.
therefore they're on a track. Well, we've got to have this done by June or July, whatever. But if we take and delay this and refer this to another group or for further study, that now puts us into next year. Well, that puts us past the election date, which of course doesn't fit with my mantra for election time. So there's all sorts of things that motivate why things happen, and therefore we have public apathy.
Well, I thought one of the more interesting things was up in Westlock recently, where there was a considerable conflict between council and the public. And they decided to use a referendum to come about a resolution. And in a democracy, a resolution should be binding.
Yes.
The resolution did vote, and it did not align with where council was. Now, the question then is, council listened and decided to change its position or go on its merry way anyway and face the consequences in the next election? I don't know. It's a fascinating experiment.
It is, but it also, it's a matter of how do you handle that decision of the public, that plebiscite, for example. Now, maybe the public didn't read it right and they actually voted incorrectly, but rather than moving on with that, then really there needs to be another process to readdress it again and to revisit and so on and so forth. But if you just go against the decision of the public, then of course the public says, well, why did you ask us for in the first place?
So here we are trying to solve modern day issues with 200 to 500-year-old governance technology that's completely ill-equipped to meet the challenges of today.
Yes.
So people are concerned about a problem, they form a collaborative, shared purpose across a city, a municipality, a province, an age, whatever scope they want to embrace. Sure. And governments and government agencies are welcome to join. And people will continue to do what they can do. Individuals, public, private, not-for-profit organizations, multi-stakeholder groups, they can join the collaborative. They become aware of each other, which means a lot of resources at the table. They talk about solutions, and then they decide what they can do together with or without government. So this is,
as you say, Greg, though, we're not set up to, and we don't engage those kinds of processes. So we're following the same old process of council meets or a government meets on Monday morning or Monday evening, and this is the agenda and right? There's no room for introducing these concepts as such. And that's also part of our problem, I think. But I like what you're saying, but the problem is that we're dealing with those institutional ways of dealing with things.
So now there's three things that we're doing because of that problem. I talked to foundations here, a major Western Canadian foundation saying, how do you fund this change? How do you do this? It's very much like, how do you embrace the idea of a corporation during the Industrial Revolution? Just a different way of being. It's a new form of organization. So we've got 3 projects underway: improving community conversations, which are being piloted in Northwest Calgary this year. And it will equip groups that want to do things with that form of organization to take it and use it, take it and go. We have a collaborative called Wellness Allies. Business is working for better. And that's, again, it's a different way of working that helps businesses sustain themselves and succeed and give back. And we also have a transition in governance where governments do better inside, deliver better across the jurisdiction they serve, mapping to well-being, of which we have some world-class leaders in that thinking, and then engage individuals, groups, organizations across their jurisdiction using the collaborative as a vehicle. So those ideas are all ready for prime time, but let's not just talk about this academically or strategically. Let's go and get dirty and make some things happen. So those 3 projects are all implementable today in any jurisdiction, in fact, every jurisdiction on the planet, without a single legislative change. So it's just ways of working better together. And we get back together, and then you bring in things like transformative practice. We've got some BOEM dialogue principles that have been pioneered over the last 30 years around how to listen and respect one another as we're talking, and recognize really the humanity in one another. And
I think
once you recognize that, we're off to the races.
I think, Greg, I would agree with what you're saying there. And I think another piece is recognizing that we as humans, we as ourselves, we're coming out of COVID and the situation that we're feeling right now, lots of fear. Lots of people are also experiencing the results of trauma, right? And isolation. And there's all sorts of things that are happening with us that in order for these things to occur, we also have to do our own work. We also have to do our work on how we reflect on how we behave in conflict. How do we behave in conflict? Because conflict, man, for a long time, when I was in a 4-year conflict every day at work, it was the other person. It was the other person, but it takes 2 people. And so it is the work that we have to do in order to change this, change the ship, move the ship in a direction that we can all be a part of and that we're going to be proud to be a part of. But we have to play a role. And that's where I think a lot of this starts, is with us. And then we can move to community, to government, and so forth. But it is all looking back at how we're behaving, how it's impacting our lives, and how we can make changes in ourselves, but also our interactions with others.
That's very helpful as we are into wrap up, Julie, is to recognize that in a 2-party conflict, whether it be personal or inter-organizational, that each party needs to come to grips with their contributing role to that conflict. And when you look at co-locate or cooperate or communicate, you're dealing with that at almost that interpersonal level. But when you get to the collaborate, you're bringing in a 3rd party. And I think what we're recognizing is the level of conflicts that we're facing today, particularly at an international level and even intercultural, are going to require 3rd-party intervention. And that in itself is an insight, is council's not likely to resolve it on its own. It probably, facing the severity and the diversity and the newness of some of these conflicts, it would be wise to bring in a 3rd party. And I recall in ways to resolve groupthink and ways to resolve some of the conflicts which we've seen at an international level in history often required a 3rd-party intervention. So I think, Greg, what you've offered today, Julie, what you've offered at the personal level, Greg, what you've offered at the organizational level is quite insightful. And thank you all.